It's 11 o'clock, and I think we're going to go ahead and get started with our next plenary session. Thank you. My name is Stacy Diebel Reynolds. I serve as the director of the Student Achievement and Wellness Unit at the Orange County Department of Education. I'm very excited today that I get to present to you, introduce rather, two of my colleagues who are two of my favorite people. And they have really dynamic presentations for you. They're going to keep your attention, and I'm excited to introduce them. So first, you know what? We're actually going to start with Pam Kahn first. So in the meantime, I'm going to let whoever's managing the slides move us to Pam's slides first, and then we'll come back to Stephen's. So as you're doing that, I'll go ahead and you got it? Okay, perfect. All right, we've got Pam Kahn. So Pam to my right here, this is Pam Kahn. She's our coordinator of health and wellness at Orange County Department of Ed. Pam works closely with nurses across the county's districts to provide 500,000 students in our county with the health services they need to be successful in school. Yes. From one nurse to another, Dr. Morgan, we know that you value that for sure. She's also immediate past president of the California School Nurses Organization. Pam has been instrumental in coordinating extra support for districts over the last 2 years. That includes assisting with vaccine distribution, contact tracing, and communicating evolving public health information like decision trees to our schools so that they can make sure students stay healthy and safe across the county. Fun fact, if you look in your program on page 8, Pam has one of the best headshots I've ever seen. She just really killed it. Pam is really a hero in our eyes and in the eyes of her 3 children and 6 grandchildren. Whether you know a little or a lot about adverse childhood experiences, I promise you'll learn new knowledge in her presentation and she'll command your attention. With that, I'll give you Pam Kahn.
Okay, well, that headshot, I was just talking to someone, I said, it's getting old, I need to change it. That was pre the COVID 15 or 20, but good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me, and it's so good to be back in person. I've missed everybody so much, and hello to everyone in Zoom land, and particularly our international attendees. That's very cool, very exciting. But it has been a really long 2 years, as we all know. Talk about stress, the young Dr. Morgan, or I was going to say Dr. Morgan Jr. because I don't think either your mom or I like to be called the old doctor, whatever, Yes, Dr. Morgan Jr.'s presentation was a wonderful precursor to what I'm going to be talking about now. How many of you in this room have heard of ACEs? Oh God, I have an educated audience. That's good because I have a very short time to present a very complicated topic. So I'm so glad that those of you have at least a glancing knowledge of what ACE is about, because I can't go really deeply into it in this time that I've gotten, but I encourage you to, if you're at all tantalized by it, find it interesting to explore it more, because it is a fascinating study, topic, construct that will explain so much of what you intuitively know and yet have not maybe even put scaffold around it and made it a formality in how you process. But it's a wonderful topic, and I'm so pleased to be able to present it here today. Okay, and how are our children? Wow, I did not know that was a Maasai greeting, and I loved that, because here's my philosophy on that. If the children are all well, that means the society is well. Children do not exist in a vacuum, and our children, if they are well, that means the parents are well and the community is well. That is a huge statement. And as we all know, we may not be scoring an A in that department right now, but we're going to work on it. We're going to talk about ACEs, early trauma, and its legacy today. So here's a definition of what ACEs is. ACEs is an acronym that stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And here was Dr. Block's definition of it. Adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. Now, fortunately, it's no longer unaddressed. This was a quote, and I don't know the date of when he said it, but it is still a huge public health threat. It starts when kids are young, sometimes during their first few months of life, and it carries us all the way until the end of our lives. And you will see how that happens, how ACEs affects us all the way through life, our physical, our emotional, and our behavioral health, not only as children, but as adults. Okay. I got a lot of text, and I apologize for that, but I'm hoping you have access to these slides that you can look at this text on your own, because they're, like I said, a short time to pack a big punch. The ACEs study was a study that talked about, let me make sure I'm on my right slide. Yeah, the ACEs study is a huge investigation between childhood maltreatment and health and how we do later in life. Kaiser Permanente started this in collaboration. Well, they started it on their own, actually, way back in the 70s, I believe, and they had 17,000 participants. Now, bear in mind that these participants were Kaiser Permanente members in the San Diego area. So right there, they were of a certain demographic and socioeconomic status, right? Which doesn't necessarily extrapolate out to who we want to study, but it was a start. It was a good start. The CDC eventually partnered with Kaiser once Dr. Vincent Folletti had started an obesity clinic for people who were grossly overweight, 100 pounds or more, not the COVID-20, but the 100 pounds or more people could come in and work on their weight. And they did, and it was a successful program. However, he found people were going along, losing weight, it was all great, and then they were dropping out. And he's like, what's going on here? They're here, they're accomplishing their goal. Why are they dropping out? And the classic story that he tells is he was interviewing a woman once, one of his dropouts, who had been successful and yet was no longer coming. And he asked her, because he said, I'm going to find out what's going on in their life, how they're, in healthcare, we always do, health and developmental history. So we're going to talk about what happened to you, how you're doing, what's your past look like. So he asked this woman, and one of the questions he asked, because he was asking about all kinds of things that happened in their life, when was the first time you had sexual intercourse? And she said 40 pounds. It was a weight study, and he was a little startled. He said, but I didn't mean your weight. But he goes, what did you say? And she goes, I was 4 years old. So he, the alarm bells went off in his head, and then he started digging into other people's history, and he found that the people that were dropping out had had some significant trauma in their past life: sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse. For example, one of the men that he was in his study had dropped out. He was bullied terribly as a child, put on all this weight. He felt safe, he felt protected. He started to lose the weight, he felt vulnerable. So the moral of this story is they found out that we adapt behavior. The ACEs study started zeroing in on the fact that we protect ourselves in any way we can. We develop behaviors, we develop attitudes that keep us safe, that help us survive. They may appear to be maladaptive responses to everyone else, but they serve a purpose for that person in their life. So that basically, there's a summary there. That study demonstrated that trauma and adverse experiences during childhood, because this inevitably would occur first in their childhood and often carry on. Chronic trauma carries on. It's prolonged, it's long-term. And there are major risk factors for the leading causes of illness and death in the United States, and we'll talk about how. The ACEs study gives you a score. There's 18 questions on the study originally, and even those have morphed through the years, but pretty much there's still a structure of 18 questions. And the ACEs score is how many of those questions you answer yes to. And those questions can be as simple as, well, none of these are simple. Was there a divorce in your family? Believe it or not, divorce is considered an adverse childhood experience. And those of you who've been through it would probably say, I do believe it. But it's not necessarily huge negative things that we think of, well, that's them, not me. Divorce is almost all of us, isn't it? Was your mom ever abused in your presence? Did anyone in your family suffer from mental health problems? That can include depression and anxiety. Those are diagnosed as mental health, are called mental health issues. Was anyone in your family incarcerated? Did you ever feel that you did not have enough to eat or weren't cared for? List of 18 questions. If you answered one, you have an ACE score of 1, 2, ACE score of 2, etc. That's how they score it. Almost 2/3 of the participants in the original study reported at least one adverse childhood experience, and 20% reported 3 or more. Again, remember who I told you the demographic of this study was. Kaiser Permanente members in San Diego, employed, certainly of probably at least middle class or approaching, lower or upper. This is a pretty good demographic that you would think was very able to handle life pretty well. And yet up to 20% had 3 or more ACEs, which is considered to be quite a hurdle to overcome. They also found there is a strong dose relationship between high ACE scores and poor health outcomes. The higher your ACEs score, the more likely you are to have poor health outcomes in later life or have diagnosable conditions, such as heart disease, obesity, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, depression, et cetera, cancer, strokes, et cetera. You can find the questionnaire, and I've put a link there. You can just Google ACEs questionnaire and you'll find it. It's all over the place if you want to take a look at what the questions are. Here are the types of ACEs that the original study looked at. 3 different types: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Abuse, we all know there's physical, sexual, and emotional. Neglect can be emotional neglect or physical neglect. And I think Ms. Snapper, Christine Snapper, who will be here to talk to you later, she's wonderful. I've worked with her, and she's probably one who will tell you the most prominent report they get is of neglect for kids rather than abuse. And that is extraordinarily harmful. We might think, well, they're not getting hit, they're not getting this, they're getting neglected, which can leave long-term and long-lasting dysfunction. And then household dysfunctions. I look at things like mental illness, incarcerated, mom treated violently, substance abuse. Did anyone in your family have a drinking or drug problem? And then divorce, as I mentioned earlier. Now, what we do know, there's far more conditions, far more circumstances that can cause trauma other than what we originally saw. For example, what about generational and social discrimination? If you're of a class that has been chronically, consistently, cumulatively discriminated against, that's a trauma. What about a child who, if this child comes from a healthy, loving home, everything is in place, is diagnosed with leukemia and has long-term painful, frightening treatments? That's a trauma. What about these kids that we're seeing? 1 million people as of now have emigrated or left, not emigrated, left Ukraine just in the last week or 2. And they're almost all women and children. You don't think those children are going to suffer from some adverse childhood experiences? Absolutely. We recently did some work at the Orange County Department of Education with Afghan refugees and the children who came over in August and have not been in school since then. First of all, what did they face before they left their homeland? What was it like living there before they left? And now they're in a new country and they have no ties to this country, no social life in school, et cetera. You think that's an adverse childhood experience? Absolutely. So it goes far beyond what the defined ones are on this slide. So what happens when a child experiences an adverse childhood event? Toxic stress, and Dr. Morgan Jr. talked about this a bit earlier. Toxic stress, we have eustress, which is a positive stress, and she sort of described that when she got up this morning, her heart was beating and she was a little stressed, but it motivates you, it gets you going. Toxic stress, and then you have acute stress, a one-time incident. You may get in a car, a fender bender. You may be robbed, which is certainly traumatic, but if it's one time, you have support, it doesn't occur again, people are there to help you, you may get psychological treatment, et cetera. What if you're in the middle of an earthquake? What if you exist through a tornado? That's acute stress, quickly and hit and run. Toxic stress is strong, frequent, or prolonged adversity and is extreme or frequent or extended activation of the body's stress response, which Dr. Morgan referred to, all the cortisol, et cetera, the hormones that come out, the testosterone, the cortisone, the DHEA, et cetera. But it's often without the presence of a supportive adult, because that gets us through. We need support. These kids, say if a child is being abused in the home, those are the people that are supposed to protect that child, but yet they're abusing that child. That child has no supportive adult to turn to. It's particularly harmful when children experience toxic stress because the bulk of your brain structures are formed by the time you are 5 years old. Who knows, when does your frontal cortex stop evolving? Yeah, Okay, I'm going to say women 22, men 28, right? No, but you're right. No, you're right. You're actually right. But I always like to tease the men in the audience and say, you guys get take a little longer to get to the finish line. You get there, but we sort of, we get there. But most of the brain structures internally are pretty well fixed by the time you're 5. So when you are undergoing toxic or extreme stress, it actually has an effect on the neurotransmitters that are going on in your brain that are helping your brain develop. Your amygdala is smaller, which controls a lot of your emotional responses. Your hippocampus, which puts together past and present, in other words, uses past experiences to justify how to respond to the present experience, is smaller. Also, your short-term memory resides in your hippocampus. And your prefrontal cortex has less real estate. Basically, cubic centimeter wise, it's smaller. So these children who have been affected by toxics, and there's all kinds of other things that go on, like synaptic pruning. When you're young, you develop all these connections between your cells, just huge. It looks like a dense forest. And then naturally your body prunes them back to say, hey, I don't need all of these. It's like a tangled garden. You want it nice, you want it functional. We put out a lot of stuff at first, and then our brain figures out what we need and don't need and take them back. Children who undergo toxic stress do not deprune. They have a mess of things in there. They're not working correctly. And since survival comes first for these kids, that's where all the energy is going. It's going towards, just creating these stress hormones, keep you going. So those stress hormones are being over and over released. They are having negative impacts on structural developments in your brain. So these children who have gone at extended traumatic periods do not develop the same brain that a so-called normal child would develop. So to have expectations for those children to behave in a manner that we see as normal is wrong. They can't, they won't. So that's where we need to adjust our expectations and our approach to these children, because, and as adults, this doesn't change, they will not react the way you think they should. They react the way they think they have to in order to survive. So what you really need to do is when you look at children like that, and or adults, because we all have them in our lives, you need to take a look at them and say, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. Everybody wants to function to their top ability. We all want to be liked. We all want to fit in. We all want to succeed. They don't want to be maladjusted. We don't want to struggle. So look at people and say, what happened to you? Maybe not overtly, because that can be an offensive and intrusive question, but certainly in yourself when you react to them. Mental health disorders, alcohol and substance abuse, and physical health issues are associated with early childhood trauma, and I'll show you why that makes total sense. Here is the ACEs pyramid. So take a look at the very bottom. You're born. You have adverse childhood experiences in your life, ongoing chronic trauma with no support. Your disrupted neurodevelopment. Your brain's not going to develop due to all the things I told you. And that was like a 10-second, introduction into what could be a semester or more course. So when your neurodevelopment is disrupted, you are unable to develop appropriate social, emotional, or cognitive reactions. You don't know how. You probably not have role models for social. Emotional, you're triggering all the time, trying to keep safe. You don't have time to develop a healthy relationship with anyone. And cognitively, A, you don't have the real estate. B, you don't have the energy. You're so distracted at trying to survive. So when you're not doing well in any of those areas, you're not going to feel too good about yourself, are you? You're a misfit. You're not succeeding. What do we do when we don't feel good? We find inappropriate intimate partners because we don't know what a sexual relationship, a normal good one is sometimes. We use drugs, we gamble, all these maladaptive behaviors to soothe ourselves. When we smoke and we drink and we use drugs, what's going to happen? We are going to develop diseases, disabilities, and social problems. If you're drinking too much, your husband or wife, partner, not going to be too happy with you. If you are smoking like a fiend, you're probably going to develop COPD or cancer, etc. And when that happens, you may suffer an early death. So you see there's a direct correlation between what happens to children in their early years if they're under toxic stress, leading to a very poor linear progression of disease, disability, and possibly early death. So this is kind of a summary, this little chart, and you can look this up too. What impacts do they have? Here's possible risk outcomes. Lack of physical activity, smoking, alcoholism, substance abuse, missed work, and all the physical and mental health things that we've discussed occur. Increased suicide risk, right? That's one of the things with depression. And again, there's the arrow that indicates that the more ACEs a child has experienced, the increase the risk of poor health outcomes. This is from kidsdata.org, and you can look this up right now. This is the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences in California. 0 ACEs, we have about a third of our kids say, no, I don't have any. May or may not be true. We all sort of have some, but as defined by possibly that 18 question scale, about a third say no. 47% of our kids say they have 1 to 3, and this is usually parent reported. 47% will say, yep, my kid's got 1 to 3 ACEs in their life. 17% of our kids have 4 or more. So that may not sound like a lot, but when you're in a class of 30 kids, that's 5 or 6 of them who have 4 or more ACEs that they're trying to get through life dealing with. That's huge when you look at it that way. Every teacher in a class that has maybe in a junior high 6 classes, it's 24 kids a day that teacher's dealing with who are battling 4 or more ACEs. This is a slide you can look up, and again, you can find this anywhere. I know it's very small, but I liked it and I thought you might want to look it up. It taught all those little circles, those little colored circles are indicative of either a physical or mental health issue or a behavioral issue. And then you have an ACEs score of 1, and that's the upper left. And you see there's small little circles. That's how much development you might have of whatever issue you're dealing with, a physical or emotional issue. ACEs score 2 is, ACEs score 0 is the top right. 1 is the top left. 2 is the center right. You see the circles are starting to get a little bigger. Bottom left is 3, and bottom right is ACEs score of 4. And the big giant green one is, I believe, suicide risk is the primary thing we worry about with that, and C. So take a look at this, dig it up on the internet. The sources, a lot of places have it. I didn't credit it because a lot of places have it and I don't know who originated it, but it's worth looking at. Another infographic, and this talks about 4 or more ACEs. And I liked this because it gave some hard percentages of what happens. 3 times the level of lung disease, 14 times the number of suicide attempts as normal, as average, 4.5 more times likely to develop depression, 11 times more likely to use IV drugs. This is a huge risk, our IV drugs, with people who are suffering from ACEs. 4 times as likely to begin having sexual intercourse by the age of 15, and that spells disaster for everybody. Thank you. And twice the level of liver disease, similar to all the things we've talked about. So that's the dark and dirty, bad, quick review of what ACEs is. It's sad, it's disheartening, but what do we do now? Safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments are critical to lessen the consequences. We can't change that brain topography. It's set, unless we still can work on the frontal cortex for a while, till late 20s. We can't change that, but we can ameliorate the effects of it and the consequences and the actions by creating stable and supportive environments. ACEs have the potential to be long-lasting and destroy lives, certainly, but they do not have to. We can help children thrive, survive, and develop and help them meet their full potential if we are able to provide them support. We need protective factors. We need to provide them with protective factors. They need social and emotional competence. We need to teach them in schools what their emotions are and how to handle them. And we need to teach them at the home and in our churches. We need to give them concrete support in time of need. Stacy later will be presenting with Christine on a program we've got at Orange County Department of Ed called Focus, which helps our schools be alerted to the fact that a child needs help, to pay a little extra attention. We need supportive social connections, and that can be in the schools, your faith communities, your own families. And we need our parents to know how to parent, right? Do we take a test to get a driver's license? Yes. Do we get a test to have a baby? No. We need to work on that. Resilience is critical. I know I used to wonder before I became educated in all of this, how come one kid comes from a disastrous, terrible environment and yet flourishes? That child is resilient. It's a process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress is the definition. One of the biggest determinants is having developing resilience is having nurturing and supportive relationships with adults. It can be one adult, hopefully more, but even one adult. There are endless stories out there of kids who say, This person got me through. Don't ever discount the fact that you may be that, even if you don't know it. And building resilience can help ameliorate some of those changes in the brain. We can, like the frontal cortex, et cetera. We help them to develop resilience and coping mechanisms, and the brain structures simmer down a bit, at least the ones that are still developing. Search Institute has identified 40 positive supports and strengths, and they break them down by age. They have adolescent supports and strengths, as well as younger kids supports and strengths. They talk about external and internal assets. Both of these are needed in a child. External assets are the community, the teachers, et cetera. Internal are their own strengths and coping mechanisms and self-soothing and understanding emotions, et cetera. The more assets that young people have, the less likely we are going to see the poor risk behaviors and the poor outcomes. I just stuck this up there. This is what the 40 developmental assets looks like, but you again can Google this easily and find it. And they have a whole list. There's the external, internal assets, and they talk about what a child needs. So those of you who are going to work with children or have children in your lives or grandchildren in your lives, take a look at these and know what you can do for those children. ACE is aware. California has been a leader in this. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris was our first California Surgeon General. She's just recently stepped down. She was a huge advocate and innovator in this area of ACEs. She worked in Oakland and basically found the same thing that Dr. Felitti did, that the adverse childhood experiences lead to a lot of poor health outcomes. ACEs Aware Initiative. California is the first state in the nation that now reimburses our doctors who treat our children who are in Medi-Cal to give them this quiz. They call it PEARLS, Pediatric Assessment. Doctors now ask the parents these questions. Parents have to fill it out because these are for kids. Ask the parents questions about what's going on in the child's life, trying to figure out trauma early and intervene early. So we don't deal with this with a 100-pound 40-year-old who's an alcoholic. And again, the focus program, which will be explained more in later. We're doing that here at OCDE. Here's some resources for you. Although if you just Google ACEs, you will find an abundance. But here are some targeted ones that may help you, at least look at what we talked about today. And what I'm going to finish is that we can't direct the wind, but we can adjust the sails, right? So thank you for listening. And like I said, I could go on for hours about this, but I hope I gave you a tantalizing peek and you look more into this topic. So thanks again for your time today.
Thank you, Pam. And all of those slides are available through the Whova app, correct? Did I pronounce that right? Whova app? Okay, Whova app. So you can access them through that. Okay, our next speaker. Phone. Nope, I don't see a phone. Okay, our next speaker is Stephan Lambert. Stephan is our prevention coordinator at the Orange County Department of Education. He's a highly sought after expert on substance community and family engagement efforts and has vast experience working in both community-based organizations and in the education sector. Stephan is one of those people who walks his talk. He has served as a volunteer advisor to a youth group participating in an alcohol and drug prevention program called Friday Night Live. And he participates on a board focused on the academic success of Latinx youth. Stephan is a new dad, and I believe that this work is personal to him and to his partner, Camille, who works in human trafficking prevention as well. Fun fact, Stephan is the voice and often the face of a lot of OCDE things. So if you call our organization and get put on hold, you will hear Stephan. He's on a lot of podcasts, including one with Dr. Morgan. And so I'm sure you'll recognize his voice when he starts speaking, but he's also very engaging and I'm very excited to introduce him to you. Thank you, Stephan.
Thank you, Stacey. Yes, I have the dubious honor of being the hold voice. So whenever you're getting frustrated and you're on hold at OCDE, now my voice is triggering for you. So anyways, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Stephan Lambert. I do work at OCDE. I'm going to jump right in because I know your time is valuable. Today, I'm going to be talking about substance use with a bit of an update. I know I've been here a few times, But today I'm going to focus a little bit on something called illicit fentanyl. I'm going to explain that. But as I always do, I think it's very important that I set the stage by describing why we're talking about substance use. How does it relate to human trafficking at a conceptual level, right? Like, why is this guy here, basically? So I feel like Harry Potter. So for substance use, there are a few key areas in which it is related to human trafficking. Number one, it's used as a means of recruitment. When young people who are using substances, they can be offered these as a means of recruitment, especially when it becomes unaffordable. Second, it can then be used as a means of control. By controlling the availability of substances, young people who are struggling with a substance use disorder can be then continuing in the life, unfortunately. And finally, risk factors. So let me explain what that means. So this, I know, and by the way, I hope the fonts in the online version are fixed. Being a design person, seeing everything in Times New Roman is traumatizing to me, but I'm going to climb the mountain. So the three kind of overarching risk factors for human trafficking are social isolation, trauma, and economic hardship, right? When we think about what pushes that vulnerability of people for trafficking across the board. And substance use, you can see up there on the left, it really touches on so many of these areas in multiple directions, right? Substance use linked with mental health disorders, and that cycle linked with family, peer, and dating violence. Intergenerationally, so when young people grow up and they have these substance use disorders, just as Pam was saying, it can affect what happens in their families and then subsequently affect the risks for their children. Down below, very importantly, this idea of marginalized populations. So you can see that we're talking about LGBTQ young people, young people who have foster care involvement, those who are dealing with homelessness, incarceration, immigration status, all of these properties linked with one another. And you see different rates of substance use in those populations as well. So it's so complicated. I know if I did like a little chart showing the strings, this would be impossible to read. But suffice it to say, substance use is one of those risk factors that's so tightly woven with so many of these others that it's important to discuss. And I went on and looked at the Polaris project to see what their latest research was and found that the 5 most common risk factors for sex trafficking among those that they got responses from in 2020, substance use was number 1, right? Surpassing all of these other risk factors, which are, of course, crucially and critically important. And I would also argue, like we just saw, linked with substance use. And then the second part here is that when you look at methods of control, as I mentioned, again, you see inducing or exploiting substance use issues at number 3, in between emotional abuse and physical abuse. So this is a very salient thing for us to be talking about. But for us who are working in very, very different roles with young people throughout the community, we have to be thinking, okay, how does this apply to what I do and to how I work with young people? And so what I'm bringing you today is a new topic that maybe isn't new. I feel like I've come full circle because I was looking at my slides from actually 3 years ago, I think. And in it, I was talking about fentanyl and how potent it is in these counterfeit pills. But even then, I did not understand what was going to take place in the following years. So today I'm going to be focusing on something called illicit fentanyl and particularly counterfeit pills. So let's jump right in. I'm going to talk about what fentanyl is, define it for you, talk about why this is now an issue and why it's happening. And finally, as Pam mentioned, what can we do about it? So let's jump right in. What is fentanyl? And I apologize, this must look absurdly small on your screens. So I promise you in the original fonts, you can read it. This is not a vision test. So, oh, there we go. So fentanyl, our definition here, fentanyl is a powerful synthetic opioid drug used for severe pain relief. And that is a very, prevention people, we're very jargony. So I'm gonna break that down for you. So let's define what we mean by powerful synthetic opioid. I'm actually gonna go backwards, starting with defining what an opioid is. And opioids are drugs that, as I said, relieve pain. They attach to our nerve cells that are all throughout our brain and body. And the name comes from opium, the opium poppy, where kind of the original opioids came from, like morphine and heroin. But also includes drugs that are synthetic, meaning they come from lab-made chemicals. This is more important when we talk about why fentanyl is exploding right now, but that's what it means. It comes from lab-made chemicals, it doesn't come from those poppies. And the last word here is powerful, by which I mean that fentanyl, as some of you have probably seen some of the news coverage, about 50 to 100 times more potent than opioids like morphine and heroin. This is very concentrated. And to give you a visual representation of that, on the left is a lethal dose of heroin, and on the right is the equivalent dose of fentanyl, right? It's a very, very minute amount, is incredibly potent. To visualize it another way, on the end of a number 2 pencil, this is also a lethal dose, about 2 milligrams, right? So this is a drug that is extremely powerful, but I do want to make a very important distinction and clarification that we're not talking about the actual medicinal fentanyl. So if anyone is using this as family members, I don't want them to stop taking their medication. That's not what this is about. We're talking about what's on the right, which is illicit fentanyl. So there are these cartels, transnational criminal organizations who are manufacturing with chemicals illicit fentanyl and putting it into street drugs like cocaine and heroin, and also these counterfeit pills, which is my major focus today. So why are we talking about this? What is going on with young people? So to that, I want to pose to you all a question here. What do you think is the leading cause of accidental death in the United States, just broadly across all ages? Do you think it is drowning, car crashes, okay, falls, or drugs? Okay, it's a spoiler because I'm here talking about drugs, which is probably why I'll use it. But those of you who said car crashes, intuitively, I think that's where we would probably go if I wasn't here talking about substance use. I promise this is larger on the other slides. Drug poisoning is the leading cause of accidental death here in the United States. And if you look at over time, what has happened, in 2012 is when it crossed paths with car crashes. So for a while, car crashes were the leading cause. However, unfortunately, drug poisoning has continued to increase, and you see that spike there. This doesn't include the last year in which it continued to rise to over 100,000 deaths in 1 year. A little bit more, looking here in Orange County, this is the rate of deaths from synthetic opioids. Remember what that means. In Orange County and in California, you can see for a while it was very low. Obviously, every death from this is tragic, but the rate was pretty stable until the last year, in which it absolutely took off. If you're to look at the age categories in which this is having the largest impact, youth and young adults, unfortunately, are being hit the hardest. And while you can see the 15 to 19-year-olds there indicated by the arrow are not the highest, it's still alarmingly high, particularly when you look over time. This is for 15 to 19-year-olds here in Orange County. You could see very, very low, thankfully, for so long. However, same thing. In the last year, absolutely skyrocketed. If you ask people who know me, they'll tell you, I don't alarm easily. I'm not an alarmist. I don't panic when I see new things coming out. I follow the data, but this is absolutely an urgent crisis. I consider this very alarming. And when you look at deaths among these young people, 19 out of the 21 opioid-related deaths among minors under 18 here in Orange County were related to fentanyl. That's more than the previous 6 years combined. This is absolutely a change in what is happening and in what our young people are dealing with. So why is this happening? What is going on that is causing this influx, this giant increase in these drug poisonings? Let's see if we can play this video. No, that's fine. It's like a 1-minute video, and actually it's from several years ago talking about the Orange County Crime Lab and their forensics team testing these counterfeit pills and seeing such a massive increase, which to me, I thought, wow, this video is from over 5 years, actually 5 years ago. And back then we were talking about it, having no idea what was coming. So here's another activity for you. Which one of these 2 oxycodone pills do you think is real? So there are fake pills that look very much like real pills. Which one of these 2 do you think is the real pill? Who thinks it's A? Who thinks that's the actual oxycodone? Okay. Who thinks it's B? Oh, all right. That's actually a trick question. They're both fake. Neither of them is genuine, but it's so so difficult to tell what is real and what is not. And this is the crux of the issue. This is what is causing so many of these fentanyl poisonings. And the DEA, back a couple years ago, seized about 2.6 million of these counterfeit pills back in 2019. But how many do you think that they seized last year? So on your hand, if you think it was twice as much, put 2, 3 times as much, 3, 4, what do you think? Go ahead, put your, how many times greater? Oh, there we go. I see somebody in the back with both hands up, and that is correct. They seized 20 million of these counterfeit pills in the last year. This is an incredible increase in the amount of fentanyl that is being manufactured, being sold here in the United States. And you can see here the comparison, a large difference in scale. This is why our communities are dealing with so many fentanyl poisonings, is simply the supply. And when you look at these operations, they're very, well, okay, I don't want to say sophisticated, but they do have these presses that make these pills look very legitimate. And in the video that you can watch later, you'll see them talking about it. And this is a press that's pressing out counterfeit Xanax. And I put in, I know it's Girl Scout cookie season. That's not why I put this here. I want to explain also why so many of these pills may be so dangerous. And it's to use this metaphor of chocolate chip cookies. I don't know if any of you do any baking. It's very difficult. It's like alchemy. I can't do it. But when making chocolate chip cookies, you end up with some in the batter that have more chips than others, right? You might get one that has 3 chips. The next one might have 15. I go for the one with 15. I lack self-control. That's a whole, I'll do 20 minutes on that later. But the point here is that the chips are not evenly distributed, right? The same thing is true when these cartels, when these organizations are stamping out these pills. They have all of this powder in there. And like we said, fentanyl is so potent, you don't need that much. So it's not evenly distributed, to the point that when the DEA tested the counterfeit pills that they had seized, 40% of them, 4 out of 10, had that 2 milligram dose in it, right? This is not a good probability. These are not good odds, and this is a very dangerous, dangerous trend. So the 3 categories, I'm going to back a little bit. The 3 categories of medications that are most typically misused are opioids, like we discussed, stimulants, such as Adderall, typically used for treating ADHD, and then finally depressants to treat anxiety, like Xanax, Valium. And the bad news is that all 3 of these drug categories are being stamped counterfeits and laced with fentanyl. So you might be surprised to hear, why would they be, Adderall? You might think opioids, that makes sense because it's acting in the same way, but it's across the board. If you ask law enforcement, all kinds of drugs are being found with fentanyl in it, street drugs, cocaine, heroin, the list goes on. So this is an issue that isn't going anywhere. So what can we do about it? I know I showed a bunch of slides with the DEA and talking about supply, but just like human trafficking, this is not an issue that we can solve on the supply side. You could fit, I just read this congressional report, you can fit the amount of fentanyl to supply the entire country with its opioid misuse needs in the back of 2 SUVs. Like, this is so incredibly potent, you cannot stop this problem on the supply side. It's just not feasible. So what we need to do, just as many of you, the work that all of you are doing here, our 3 populations of concern here when it comes to fentanyl are, number 1, young people who are beginning to misuse medications. So on the prevention side, which is where most of my work is focused, is helping young people make healthy decisions and move them away from that trajectory. Second is people in recovery from substance use. Like I mentioned, many people have no idea that what they're taking has this fentanyl in it, has this tremendous risk to them. And those who are in recovery, their tolerance has dropped. The likelihood of them having this fentanyl poisoning is much higher. And then finally, people who lack access to affordable medications. This may be surprising because it's a little different than the other 2 categories that we're talking about. But people who do not have access to those medications are buying them online and at times not vetting where they're coming from and ending up with these counterfeit pills. So these are the 3 calls to action that I would suggest. Number 1, help to communicate the risks. I'll talk about that more in a second. 2, think about something called naloxone. which I'll explain as well. And then finally, let's reduce the stigma of substance use as a community. So number one, how do we help to communicate the risk? I would suggest that one of the key messages we have to communicate is safer isn't safe. This trajectory to medicine misuse oftentimes hinges on this belief that young people have that, oh, this is a pill, it's safe, it comes from a pharmacy, it's not dirty like those other drugs, like street drugs. And there's this false sense of safety that comes with that. We need to rewrite that script and help them to understand that any drug, whether it's legal or illicit, whether it's real or counterfeit, affects our brain and body, particularly with young people, affecting that brain development, right? We're talking about synaptic pruning and all the things that happen in that young brain, which are so amazing, but unfortunately can be disrupted by any drug. Second, do not trust that pill, right? And I know that conscientious consumption and ethical purchasing is, I know, part of what you teach and what you discuss, and this idea of counterfeit goods, right, and knockoffs, and how that supplies and powers a lot of the black market. But when we're talking about fake shoes, the stakes are a little different, right? What the same thing here, though, is the underlying principle. What matters to people who sell counterfeits, whether it's shoes or bags or pills, it's money. And it's their money versus the health of our young people. And we have to communicate that to them to understand that is what this is about. And the dealers out there selling these things don't have your best interests at heart. And finally, know your pharmacy. We did talk about affordable medications. There is, and when you get the slides, you can click that link. There are ways to check to see if your online pharmacy is a legitimate board certified pharmacy before you purchase things off of Snapchat, Facebook, that sort of thing. Being able to vet that. And if you're having difficulty affording your medications, we do have support programs here in Orange County through the healthcare agency to help with that. Second is naloxone. So anybody heard of naloxone? Just excellent. So I see about half of you have. So I carry it around with me on my work bag, but this is naloxone. So naloxone, most commonly seen as Narcan, this nasal spray, is a medicine that can reverse an opioid poisoning or an overdose. And it's very easy to use. You can get training on how to use it. And you do not need a prescription. You can get this. It's behind the counter, but you don't need a prescription. And it's so important to get training to learn how to respond, recognize the signs of opioid poisoning, and to understand the laws that protect you if you administer it. But it's very, very easy to use. I know I'm short on time, so I'll sort of rush through that. But I would suggest that just like an EpiPen, my son mentioned I'm a new father. I have an 18-month-old. He has an egg allergy. And so we keep an EpiPen at home. But I would suggest if you know someone who has a substance use disorder or is experimenting with medicine misuse, keeping this at your home is just like keeping an EpiPen. It's a medicine. It can help address an acute medical emergency. Let's reduce stigma and let's make sure that we have the potential to save lives. Which brings me to the last point. Stigma is something that we could get up here and do 3 hours about. It applies across all of those risk factors that we were talking about earlier. But for me in particular, I just wanted to plant a seed for you. When it comes to substance use, a lot of times we don't want to talk about it. When we do parent workshops, it's hard to get people to show up because there's that stigma around substance use. So these are just 3 terms. I said words, but 3 terms that I don't use anymore. And this number 1 is drug habit, right? And it's a substance use disorder. Second is addict. I don't use that. I know some people self-apply that. That's fine if that's part of their recovery process. I don't use that because it has connotations. And the last part, kind of surprisingly, is substance abuse. And NIDA has found, the National Institute on Drug Abuse has found, there's different outcomes and different beliefs that even healthcare practitioners have when you view something as substance use versus substance abuse. And so even the words and the terminology that we use can have power and can help us to reduce this stigma. I didn't want to leave without resources. So back here, these are on the prevention side, 6 parenting practices that'll help reduce the chance of a drug or alcohol problem. This is for parents to use for some of those parenting practices we talked about. The second one is heroin, fentanyl, and other opioids, more specific to what we're talking about, including things to know about seeking out treatment and recovery. And then finally, how to respond with naloxone. These are all from drugfree.org. And they also have the Spanish equivalent here as well. These are all clickable in the slides. Hopefully you'll be able to access that. But that's my last slide. I just wanted to say to thank you for your time and to really think about all of those complex risk factors, the way that substance use affects our young people, affects the families in which those young people live, and how can we as a community work to prevent that and reduce the stigma around it to make sure that young people get all the help and support that they need. Thank you.
I don't think, oh, this one's working great. We're going to do some Q&A for just a few minutes. Thank you, Derek. And we'll go ahead and, oh, we've got the Slido. Perfect. So if you would like to ask a question via your cell phone or computer and submit it to the slido.com, please do so. And we'll go ahead and get started with the first question. Stephen, I'm going to give you this microphone because the first question is for you. Why would the drug cartels want to kill their drug customers by adding fentanyl? It seems counterproductive for the profit margin of repeat customers.
That's a great question. So one of the issues that I didn't discuss in depth was why they're using fentanyl. And it's an economic one. Like I was mentioning, money-wise, you can create many more of these pills and much more of these drugs using illicit fentanyl because it's cheaper to produce. You don't have to have football fields worth of opium poppies growing, cultivating that, and then processing it into a powder, into heroin and drugs like that. It's extremely affordable for these transnational criminal organizations or cartels to do, even though it carries with it such a massive risk. And even though I do want to mention, though so many of those pills do have the potential dose, right? It depends on your own tolerance for those drugs. And that, I think, is why we see so many young people who maybe do not have that tolerance level, who are just beginning to experiment with some of these medications and misusing them, why you see those fatal poisonings as well. Because even though perhaps if you did have a higher tolerance, it wouldn't cause that poisoning. If you don't have that tolerance, it might. So I know that it's a complicated question, a complicated answer as well.
I have another one for you that before we move it to Pam, are schools educating on the dangers of fentanyl?
That's a good question. I mean, drug education and substance use prevention is built into the school systems as a requirement for ed code. It looks very different depending on what district you're in, what school you're in, and what grade you're in. I will say that I, in my role, am doing everything I can to go to the health educators, to the health teachers, to nurses, school social workers, counselors, to give them these resources, to provide them with this information. Because, yeah, some of the textbooks that we're using out there are a little dated. I mean, things like vaping, things like this illicit fentanyl issue, they're emerging and new. And so I think it's our role to go out there, provide that professional development for these educators so that they're empowered with it. So to answer your question, I think it varies. I know it's an unsatisfying answer, but the response to that is we need to get these tools, resources, and information into the hands of our teachers so that they can teach it.
Thank you. The next is for Pam. So if you want to share the mic. Pam, how accurate is the ACE data if it's parents that are self-reporting the number of ACE events in a child's life? Likely much higher?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Obviously, our 0 to 5 can't answer on their own. So the physicians ask the parents, and absolutely there will be some reluctance to report if mom says, yeah, I'm getting beaten by dad. She's likely not going to say that, right? However, it is an opportunity to create a dialogue, to start a conversation. And some moms will say, yeah, my husband's in jail. I got no one to help me. And that allows a pediatrician or nurse practitioner, whoever the provider is, to step in and start intervening. So no, we're not going to get accurate data from the pearls per se. And anything that is self-reported, even the ACEs studies, because that's adults taking it, reporting their own histories. We're not always honest, are we, about anything? I mean, do we all? You ask me how much I weigh, and I'm going to lie to you. I can tell you right now. So we don't report accurately always, but it opens a door and it's an avenue. It's not perfect. And I always have to remind people, do not let the perfect get in the way of the good. It's an opening.
Another question. What can you study post-grad to best serve children and parents to overcome ACEs and build resilience?
I think you have to certainly Certainly study developmental psychology and physical development in children. You have to understand how their brains form. We have to have a knowledge of healthy interactions with parents. Parenting per se is a very subjective and difficult. We all have different approaches to parenting, but we would need to certainly understand. One of the things I'm very keen on is motivational discussions, how to motivate someone without lecturing them and telling them what to do. I think if you understand the dynamics that occur in early childhood, the learning curves of early children, many of the childhood developmental psychologists, Bettelheim, all of those, understand the stages of children's development and learn how to help parents adapt to those stages realistically. And I'm going to tell you, every one of us has to help parents be better parents. So support our parents in this society too. They need help. They're often the products of traumatic environments themselves. It's a cycle that repeats. You cannot in isolation treat a child. The whole family needs to be taken into consideration and treated. So be aware of that whole system.
Thank you. Next question's for Stephan. I'm going to ask as many as I can in 3 minutes. That's what we've got left, but some really great questions coming in. How do we encourage teens to stay away from drugs? For example, if we're mentoring them in a one-on-one relationship, how do we bring up this conversation?
That's a great question. I think one of the best ways to have an organic conversation around it is to use something called teachable moments, where if you're watching a show together or there's something going on in popular media or in the news that's related to substance use, or even driving down the freeway and you see a billboard for a marijuana dispensary, that is a cue and a way to say, hey, did you see that? What do you think about that? And asking them about their experiences and their opinions and their thoughts. I think leading, just like Pam said, not with a lecture, but inquiry, and asking them, feeling out, what do they know about this? What do they think? And then gently guiding them. If you sense that they're on that trajectory towards substance use, reminding them gently about some of these facts, pointing them toward accurate information, and reassuring them that substance use doesn't define their personality, doesn't need to define their friend group, and that you're there to support them if they want to take a move away from substance use, as a listener, as somebody who's going to be there to help nurture that growth.
Okay, and there's a question about, do you have the slide deck on fentanyl available in Spanish?
So I actually have to submit this for Natalia's going to kill me. She's our who's doing a lot of the interpretation and translation. I do have to submit this to her because I'm doing a lot of presentations about it and I want to make that available.
Okay, and I'm going to end with this question. It's for Pam. Has there been a convergence in the research between ACEs and neuroplasticity?
Oh, whoa, who asked that one? You're on right track. No, not to my knowledge, there hasn't been. And that's an interesting dovetailing, isn't it? Neuroplasticity, really, I'm going to put it very simply. Whoever asked the question probably could describe it better than mine. I will, is that the ability of the brain to react and form and adapt, for lack of a better word. So no, there is not. However, having said that, not to my knowledge, there's not a formalized study, but there's studies out there galore, and I certainly am not aware of all of them. But to answer the question on that is one of the things that we work on with building resilience and protective factors to try and change the structures that you can impact. If a kid is 15, I'm probably not going to be able to get the hippocampus, the amygdala, all the other small internal structures. I may be able to certainly affect the frontal cortex and some other patterns of behavior. We all have muscle memory. So that's where neuroplasticity comes in. I don't have any data or information on the exact study of it, but that's why we try to build the resilience, the protective factors, and consequently neuroplasticity comes into play on that. So great question. Whoever got that, you get extra credit for the day.
Okay, it's now noon, so we're going to go ahead and I believe we have lunch, but I'll let Dr. Morgan come up. And before we do that, if you had a burning question that wasn't answered, please feel free to come and ask them at the very end, okay?
Absolutely. And that's why I wanted to make sure you understand that lunch is not just to feed yourself. It is to get to know somebody. So please sit with people that you've never met before. Find people, ask questions. This conference is also about networking. And food is going to be, You can get it and eat outside, or there be the room behind. We have inside seating because we weren't sure about the weather. So be back and in your seat and ready for the next session at 1 o'clock, when we will have our survivor keynote, Kathy Givens, and our legal advocacy keynote, Sarah Byrne. See you in an hour.